Hello to everyone tuning in to the Aerospace Ambition Podcast. I'm Kieran, joined by my fellow co-host Marius. As aerospace engineers, our focus is on the intersection between sustainable aviation, climate change, and AI. In this episode, we're exploring the practicalities of avoiding and managing contrails, the ice clouds formed by aircraft in cruise, which warm the climate at least as much as aviation CO2 emissions. Marius, who do we have the pleasure of hosting today?
Today we are thrilled to have Alejandra Martín Frías join us on the show. Alejandra is at the forefront of operational contrail management, serving as the head of contrail research and sustainability at Flightkeys. Additionally, she's pursuing an industrial PhD focused on contrail mitigation strategies. Recently, she showcased her innovative work at the Sustainable Skies conference, where she collaborated with notable organizations like Breakthrough, Google, and American Airlines. Alejandra, welcome on the show.
Hi, thank you, Marius. Thank you, Kieran. It's a pleasure to be here. I've listened to all of your episodes and it's an amazing podcast.
It's very kind of you. It's great to have you. So you pursue your PhD in Madrid, right? And you work with Flightkeys, the company you work with in Vienna.
Exactly.
What do you prefer, Madrid or Vienna?
Oh, wow. That's a tough question. Either my PhD tutor or my boss are going to get very upset. I mean, they both have their advantages and disadvantages, but it's a great collaboration because on the one hand, you do the research, which is more university focused, and the PhD focus on the publishing. But then it's amazing to be working on this specific topic and see that the research that you're researching goes directly to the operation basically in a couple days or in a couple months. So it's very rewarding to see. And you get to meet great minds from the academic world, but also the people who actually make the decision in terms of the operators and the policymakers and people in the industry. So I would say that I'm like Hannah Montana and I have the best of both worlds here. A bit of a millennial reference. I guess most of the audience are not in that category, but so very blessed.
So you mentioned that part of your daily work is flight planning, and you're working right at the intersection of research and flight planning, which makes it very interesting. So what is the chain of events required to take an aircraft from A to B? Can you take us through the process a little bit?
Yes, of course. If you don't mind, I'm going to make a little introduction into what Flightkeys is, because maybe some of the listeners are not aware of what it is. So Flightkeys is one of the main flight planning service providers. It's a software company, and they provide a wide range of services from rain prediction to the flight planning tool, which is the core product of Flightkeys, and then support for pilots during the flight through an EFB electronic flight bag tool called Loretta. And so we follow the entire process of designing a flight, so to say, from origin to destination, the hours, the fuel required, the mass calculations, and everything necessary for the flight dispatchers to get a sense of what trajectory the flight is going to fly, how much it's going to cost, how much fuel is going to be needed, how that fuel is going to be distributed in terms of reserve, of cruise, of any tankering options, of course. So it's a very complicated thing. It's a very complicated software. And then from that, once the flight is ready to be used, the trajectory is designed, then the flight dispatcher can choose to file that flight. Eurocontrol or the aviation organization in charge would approve that flight. And then this flight will be sent to the electronic flight bag so that the pilots can check the route and the flight level required for the minimum cost throughout the entire route. Flightkeys, like many other service providers, they are specialized in giving the minimum cost route to all airlines. That in many cases also means the least fuel, but not always. It's specialized in minimum cost. It's a great product. If anybody's looking for a flight planning software, highly recommend Flightkeys.
One of the things that really sets Flightkeys apart at the moment is your pursuit of contrail avoidance and contrail management. So as far as I'm aware, you're conducting various trials, right? So In the previous episode, we had a question from Beth and Owen, and that was, how can we develop a fast response prediction of ice supersaturated regions? So these regions in which persistent contrails form, the ones which warm the climate the most. So how can we develop this fast response prediction of these regions in order to enable effective and reliable contrail management?
Okay. So, I mean, what we do in Flightkeys, which we believe it's the way to go, so this is why I'm going to answer this question this way, is we import the ice supersaturated regions predictions, the ISSRs, into our system. And on the pre-tactical phase, so when we are still calculating the trajectory or the lower cost trajectory for the flight to fly, we account this ISSRs in the mix for those flights that we want to avoid contrails. And then, of course, the ISSRs change through time. So if we're planning a flight 10 hours before the departure time, that those ISSRs can change because meteorology, the farther away on the path you go, the less precise it is. So then that's what the EFB tool Loretta is used for, because so we plan this flight 10 hours before departure, let's say, and we reroute around the predicted ISSRs that we have at that moment, the best prediction of ISSRs that we have at that moment. But then right before the flight, the pilot can update these ISSR predictions and get the latest ones that are available at the moment of the flight. So then any last minute changes that could happen during the flight. So let's say, oh, the ISSR that was predicted to be in this area, now it's moved slightly to this other area, then the pilot knows that right before the flight, and during the flight, he or she can ask ATM to make a slight change, a small reroute during the flight to account for this small change compared to the pre-tactical prediction.
You've got two different tools that address this problem of contrail avoidance. You've got Flightkeys 5D and you have Loretta.
Yes.
Can you explain the differences between those two tools? Is it one's applied for pre-tactical, one's applied for tactical? Is that the key difference there?
Exactly. So Flightkeys 5D is the tool that flight dispatchers use to calculate the trajectories, the fuel, the cost, and all of the data that goes to the flight before the flight takes place. And they can play around with that. So the system gives you a trajectory, a certain amount of alternates, of routes, of stars and SIDS to take off and land, and all of this aircraft or flight data. And then once the dispatcher is happy with, I guess, the route, then they can file it, and then it's up to the authorities to approve this flight plan. And then this flight plan is sent to the pilot, who's going to be the one that essentially is going to fly this flight. And then they're going to be able to see in flight, they're going to be supported. It's kind of like the classic EFB that they already have in the aircraft, showing the different flight levels that they're supposed to fly and the different points in the route that they're supposed to touch upon. With the difference that in this one, it's more modern, cooler, and you have a comparison of so you have like a projected, it's very hard to show without an image, but along the route that was planned, there's this green area that shows the pilots in flight what is the most cost optimal area for them to fly across. Because again, so last minute changes compared to when you plan it pre-tactically could be weather changes, could be contrail changes. And now in flight, you have a more cost optimal solution, more cost optimal flight level that you didn't account for when you were doing the pre-tactical analysis. And then it's up to the pilot to decide to maybe request a flight level change or to stay where it is. And all of this, you can see it. So how much fuel would it cost to us for a flight level increase or decrease, or any changes throughout the flight. So it's basically a tool to support pilots. The flight dispatchers has nothing to say about it, and the pilots only see their own flights during the flight. And it's a great tool because we also believe in Flightkeys when it comes to contrail avoidance, that as many people, that's important that everybody along the way is informed of what contrails are. And since pilots are the ones that finally are going to take the decision to avoid them or not, it's great that they are involved in this and that they know why they should request a flight plan, a flight level change last minute, because it's important, because this way they would save this amount of energy forcing by avoiding this Contrail region, this ISSR region. And I don't know if you know, but my boss, Raymond Sopp, and many other founders in the company are pilots. And they've been pilots for many decades. So this is something that for them, it's very important to keep the pilots within the loop of all of these changes and to make tools that are pilot friendly, so to say.
Right. You've mentioned the EFB, so the electronic flight bag, multiple times. And I guess along this process chain of avoiding or managing contrails, there is a differentiation to make. And that is, you could, well, actually deviate flights and run experiments like that, right? So you actually reroute aircraft and gather the data. But there's also a great value in doing simulations, because there you have much more information at hand, and you could generate much more, well, data to be analyzed then. So in your presentation in Brussels, you were presenting the results of a simulation, right? Maybe you could also outline what Flightkeys is currently focusing on, and if Flightkeys has ever run real-world deviations as well, apart from simulations.
Yes, 100%. So this is going to be a long one. I hope to not lose track. So Flightkeys is currently doing two things. On the one hand, they're performing simulations, as you say. So one of the main advantages, or two of the main advantages that Flightkeys has compared to other university-centered simulations, even though many of them are great and super high-tech and super amazing, is that Flightkeys counts with real aircraft data, real airline data, and real cost prediction for airlines. Because, many times, for example, when it comes to fuel pricing is something private, it's confidential information, and airlines don't disclose what fuel deals they have with the fuel companies. And then, university simulations, for example, they have to have a generic price fuel for these things. Whereas us, we have always the latest navigation data, fuel data, price data, over flight cost, all of these things. So we can really give an accurate view of how flights would look. And then the other thing is that we have flight data from real airlines that use our system. So those are the two main advantages. So what we do is, on the one hand, we perform the simulations where we take some of our customers' data when they allow us. We beg, or many times no. I'm actually joking. This is another thing, it's completely out of the question, but we have many airlines who are actually asking us to perform the simulations as a keynote when people say, oh, airlines are not interested, or airlines really want to know, hey, we're starting to hear noise about this. Can you tell us how much it would cost us? And here we go. And then we are encouraged to use their data and to perform the simulation. So then we import all of their flights into this lab environment, where we have all of our Contrail features and everything, so I can break and play around with. And then we run all of these flights with Contrail avoidance. And what we do is that we evaluate all of the flights. First, we calculate them as we usually would with the minimum cost route. And then we analyze these flights with the COSIP model, which is one of the Contrail models available out there. And we get back a value of energy forcing. All of those flights that generate warming contrails are going to be rerouted around the ISSR prediction areas that we have imported into our system. And then we're going to reevaluate these new trajectories, and we're going to compare them with the original ones. So we're going to have a value of rerouted trajectories, or the Contrail optimal trajectories, and the opposite cost optimal trajectories that would have run in the real world. And then what we can do is that then we can compare the difference between the two. How much cost would it have added to operate this flight? How much fuel increase? Was there any delay or time cost associated to it? And then, of course, which is another of the big things, another of the big comments that comes with it, is this flight even reroutable? Because, of course, we are talking about congested airspaces and lots of congestion and airspaces that you cannot avoid and whatever. And those are at the moment the 4 core parameters that we look at. And that is a huge part of what Flightkeys is doing. And that is what we presented in the Eurocontrol meeting for summer simulations that we did with one of our big American customers. And then on the other hand, we started recently this year, very exciting news, performing live trial simulations with another of our low-cost European carriers. And for the moment, we're not performing Contrail avoidance. That most likely will come in the next months. What this career is doing is that we select specific flights, we run the COSIP model, we get a value of energy forcing and predicted areas where this energy forcing is going to form. And then this airline is going to try to stick as precisely as possible to the route that we have planned. Because, many times then when the airlines go out and then there's delays and there's airport delays and then there's weather changes, and it's very hard to assure that the route that was planned is going to be stuck to 100%. So in this case, we get pilots that are, they are like, okay, we have to keep this flight plan as close as possible as the one that was planned. And then they're going to run this exact flight. And we're going to verify, or not ourselves, Breakthrough Energy, Mark Shapiro, is going to check if that flight that we have planned did generate the contrails that were predicted or not. If there were no contrail predictions, then did it really not generate any contrail? That's good. If there were contrails predicted to happen, did they really happen? And this is a way for us to start refining the COSIP model in this case. And then in some months from now, we will start actually performing contrail avoidance trajectories and start analyzing the efficiency of those. And those are our two core works that we're doing at the moment when it comes to contrail avoidance, and getting amazing results, amazing engagement from the airlines. Of course, it's something that airlines are a bit scared of, but I have to say they're getting more and more invested because the values that we're getting are very low when it comes to cost. So of course, it's something that airlines get very happy about. And so that's it.
This is very exciting. I mean, that there's such a huge interest. I can perfectly imagine that this is also a great way for you to establish this relationship early on with airlines, right? And communicate the importance, first of all, of contrails, the relevance, but then also the potential feasibility. When I see these simulations, I always ask myself, but when are airlines actually going to do like real world deviations, because it's great to get these analyses within your partnership that you have. I would like to have one of those, to be honest. But, there's a difference to actually making the real world deviations, because you pointed out that you can tweak it in such a way that actually the fuel penalty is very low or even close to nothing. For me, that's an argument to do it. It's it's a no-brainer. So what is holding back airlines to push the button and do real deviations?
So I can imagine that what is really pushing airlines back is the entire debate still surrounding contrail avoidance. When I started working in Flightkeys 3 years ago, and we started researching contrail avoidance, we attended the Royal Aeronautical Society back then, and that's how we got into contact with Mark Stettler and Mark Shapiro. First time I met Kieran. And back then it was like 50 people in a room talking about a topic that I had never heard of. It's still very funny because when I still tell my parents what I'm researching, they're still like, nah, shut up. You're what are you talking about? How can that be bad? So it's really something that people are still not, people still don't know about. And it was very new. And in these 3 years, the world of contrail avoidance has changed immensely. It has gotten such a big boom. More and more people are researching into it. More and more airlines are getting interested, but it's still fairly new. I know that Ian Paul said that we have the science already prepared because the military people have been using it for centuries, for a century. But as far as commercial aviation goes, this was not a deal until 3 years ago, last year, I don't know. So I guess airlines are still waiting for this confirmation of it's a sure science, let's go for it. Everybody agrees on it. Everybody agrees on the metric, hard thing to do. Everybody agrees on how warming it is. And there's still a lot of controversy on the media. There was this paper by David Lee that came out a month ago or 2 months ago, specifically highlighting the uncertainties surrounding it. And then, airlines read this and then they get very scared immediately because what if we increase the fuel consumption and then we're going to be the bad guys because we tried to do this and then it's not certain. So I think that's what it's making airlines more and more scared. And in Flightkeys, what we try to tell our customers and anybody who's interested is, look, there's going to be uncertainty surrounding the science. And that's something that we're working on. That's why we're doing live trials. That's why we are doing all of the simulations. And we have more and more great minds thinking of this problem constantly. But what we want you to see this is as a risk reward scenario, the same way, I don't know, you go to the casino, not saying I go to the casino, but you know, I mean, the same way you go to the casino and you bet on something knowing what the potential reward could be and what the loss of what it's the given loss that you're willing to take. So what we're telling you is, look, you could have a reduction of 70% of energy forcing with an investment of 0.02% increase in cost. It could be that suddenly it's not minus 70% energy forcing, then maybe it could be minus 10% energy forcing, and we overestimated how much that was. But the risk that you have to consider, if for you this potential gain or potential loss, or however you want to put it, is worth it, is 0.02% increase in cost. Is it still appealing to you? Knowing that there's uncertainty, knowing that there's doubt about it, knowing that it's still something that's going on it's still on the way of research, but I think that the risk is so low and the potential benefit could be so big that it's still worth considering. And I'm a huge fan of Ian Paul and everything that he says. And yeah, we want to tell our airlines, like, yes, of course there's risk. We're not going to tell you, you're going to avoid 100% all of these things if you use our methods. Where we're telling you is, like, we can tell you that a precise cost estimate of how this is going to cost, because we have a very precise cost estimation tool, is telling us that the cost is very low. And that is how we want to not sell it, but to convince airlines, not as this is a sure science, so bet on it, is the risk reward is so big that you should go for it.
Yes, you mentioned there's a lot of uncertainties in contrail prediction and the climate impact prediction compared to that of CO2. As we had Dr. Bethan Owen on the show last week, she highlighted the fact that you've got CO2, which can last for many hundreds of years in the atmosphere, whereas contrails only last for up to a day. So there is the trade-off there that any additional fuel that you burn is going to be lasting, the CO2 will be lasting there for a long, long time. So I'm just wondering, what ways do you use at Flightkeys to really validate contrail management and maybe to prove your parents wrong that they're...
There's no way proving my parents wrong, but yeah, when it comes to fuel, I have to say that is so. For example, we talked about in my summer simulation, we saw that the increase in cost would be 0.07%, and the increase in fuel would be 0.11% if we tried to reroute all flights that generate contrail warming in a series of simulation that was over 49,000 flights. So the increase in fuel wouldn't be that high. And then, I mean, I think that the thing about fuel and CO2 is a huge problem for aviation, but for many other industries. And I think that this is going to be more philosophical, general. The human being as a whole, we have to reduce our carbon consumption. Aviation, of course, but also, agriculture, the other transportation, cars, everything. So I think that we all have to collectively reduce CO2 and reduce fuel consumption. And when it comes to aviation, we're consuming so much fuel that if the potential of reducing energy forcing by a lot comes from increasing fuel consumption by 0.11%, and that is the maximum. If you go rerouting every single flight that generates warming contrails, then in the paper that's coming soon, we also mentioned that you could strategize which flights to reroute and which flights not to. Mark Stettler and Roger Thiel talk about the big hits concept and how you can, select only those 2% highest warming flights that could, reduce the energy forcing by 80%. Or in Flightkeys, we are now incorporating this cost-based avoidance, which basically consists of, airlines can select which flights to reroute based on a relation between how much energy forcing you can reduce to which price. So the highest reward for the minimum price flights could be selected. And that's something that then, if it's a cost value, airlines can have the say on how much money they want to invest in it. And the whole thing is that you can go from rerouting, let's say, 5,000 flights to rerouting 1,000 flights or less and still have a minimum impact. And then, of course, the fuel increase would be even lower. So we would be adding very little fuel, and the potential reward could be so high. And it's not just, how, airlines are very bad because they're increasing their fuel consumption by 0.11% because they want to avoid contrails, which could potentially reduce the radiative forcing of the flight by 60%. If somebody comes pointing aviation for that, then that's a bit ridiculous. We can start by, I don't know, this is me rambling a bit, but making cars in airports electric, or there's so many other options we could go for to save fuel, but not on research to avoid non-CO2 effects. That seems also like, I don't know, going on the wrong direction.
Mm-hmm. How do you validate what you do, what influence you have? I mean, you could, take, forecast weather data and put them through the numerical or physical prediction pipeline, but you could also use observational data, right? And for example, the Google approach is observational data. And how do you validate this? And are you purely relying on what Google is doing, or are there like many different approaches to validate this?
There are different approaches to validate this. Right now, Flightkeys is not validating the results that we get. Specifically also because Flightkeys, and we know this because we're collaborating with Google Research and Breakthrough Energy, and many times they ask, can you rerun flights from 8 months ago? Can you rerun the summer simulations using this other model? And because Flightkeys is a flight planning software, what we do is we try to simulate the real scenario of an airline, and an airline would not have the need to reroute flights 8 months in the past, right? So Flightkeys is usually focused more on the future flight planning. We can reroute flights, we can recalculate flights certain amount in the past, but we don't keep the aircraft data, like the weather data and the restriction data from 8 months in the past, because that for Flightkeys is not useful. So what we do is we run our simulations, and then we share the data with our partners, and then they are in charge of validating that. So of course, we are collaborating with Breakthrough Energy through their Contrail map and all of the other apps. They're always verifying the models in the past. And then there's also Google, who's are collaborating with Google Research, and it's an amazing team. You should interview Dinesh, because Dinesh is great. and he, and they're also, they use satellite data to verify it, which is also very cool. But Flightkeys on its own, we're not verifying afterwards the process, so to say. That we leave it to the other experts.
And you mentioned that you use COSIP, the Contrail Cirrus Prediction Tool, developed by Professor Schumann at DLR. So we're just wondering if are there any limitations to this method in terms of implementation for your purposes? And are there potentially any alternatives that you could be using? And have you compared these models to COSIP in terms of their accuracy or their prediction score?
So, I mean, I think that there's limitations to every model. if you ask anybody, they can all say, well, of course, every model has its limitations. COSIP, as far as I understand, I'm not an expert in COSIP by all means, but all of the models that depend on meteorological data have the clear drawback that meteorological data is uncertain. And even as Ian Paul said, well, now maybe that the need comes by that we need better forecasts for ISSRs and whatever, then maybe the models just improve a lot by sheer improvement of the weather models. But as long as the weather models are not as good, then you are subject to the model having uncertainties. We are comparing different models. So we have the COSIP model. Then we also we're gonna start also testing the Google model. So the Google model is the ISSR prediction. So as we know, they use AI to predict to the future what happened in the past, so to say, with AI, and it's very cool. Again, I cannot explain it as Dinesh, but it's great. And so that's something we're going to start using to predict the ISSRs, and how the ISSRs that Google predicts are different from those that weather models predict. And then on a third area that we're also going to compare is the ACCFs. Do you know what the ACCFs are?
ACCFs are algorithmic climate change functions. So they're effectively a measure of climate sensitivity. So the degree of temperature change that you're expecting from a particular flight segment. And that could be for contrails, it could be for NOx primarily. So what they do is they parameterize these warming effects based on a small number of parameters, which are decided based on probabilistic analysis. So they've tried to narrow it down to just a few parameters, so like maybe temperature, pressure, humidity for contrails. And based on those parameters, they try and predict what the contrail climate forcing would be for a particular contrail produced. So they're a lot different in the way that COSIP works, because COSIP is explicitly modeling the contrail itself and trying to capture all of the different parameters, whereas this is a much simpler way to do it. Obviously, the computational load is a lot less, and it means that we can get a first order estimate of these effects compared to more elaborate modeling like COSIP.
Wow, that was amazing. I would never have been able to explain it as good as you have, so thank you. But the core advantage of ACCFs is that it also includes NOx and other non-CO2 effects, and that's also something that we want to compare with COSIP and with the Google model. So we are working on comparing other models and see how this would work. But regardless of the model, and regardless of the metric, and regardless of everything, what Flightkeys really wants to come across is, as we mentioned before, the risk-reward scenario of all of the models have their uncertainties. That's something everybody's working on, but the risk that you have to be willing to take as an airline is an increase of cost of 0.0 whatever percent to potentially avoid contrails. Would you be interested? Yes or no? Yeah. Regardless of the model.
So now that we've seen 3 approaches to actually predict contrails, which have been laid out here in detail, it also makes sense to then think about this whole topic of cost optimization. And you've already laid out the process in the beginning. Okay, how do you plan a flight to get from A to B? Right now, airlines still have allowances for these CO2 emissions, right? So right now, when you say you're helping airlines to optimize the cost, then what's going in is cost of fuel, it's overflight charges, and of course, also being late, there are also associated charges with that, right?
Yes, maintenance costs, everything.
Maintenance costs, there's such a long tail, right, connected to being on time as well. But soon, it's going to get more complicated, because then there is also this dynamic ETS kind of markets with CO2 certificates, right? So how is that incorporated in a flight planning product at all? Because it must also be part of the cost calculation, right?
Yes. So how we are envisioning this is, the final cost, the big C, when you're looking at like an equation, will be a sum of different small C's. So I should say the cost of fuel, the cost of overflight charges, the cost of this and this. And then we plan to add a separate C called the cost of environment or cost of contrails. And how we're going to account for that. So for example, now for contrail avoidance, we're going to use grid data. So until now, all of our simulations used hard restrictions to avoid the ISSRs, but that method is not very efficient, and it will never really go operationally, because that would over congest the aircraft even more, and ATM is going to kick us in the gut for it. So what we plan to do is this cost-based avoidance, which basically gives a certain cost to a value, to a joule, for example. Now, if we're thinking of COSIP, energy forcing is returned in joules, so you can give a certain cost per joule. So there's different areas that have different warming potentials, and that warming area will have a value of joule per meter. So if the aircraft crosses that area and it flies 10 meters through that area, that's going to give you a value in joules. And now that amount in joules can be transformed to cost. Well, can be transformed to CO2 equivalents through Mark Stettler can explain that, but through some magical formula that I don't know if I remember it, but it's in our paper.
CO2 equivalence, and then depending on the metric, right, you would get an equivalence, and then what you're referring to is that there is some kind of market regulation that puts non-CO2 equivalence in relation to CO2 emissions.
Yeah, you can have a value of dollars per ton of CO2 equivalents at the same value that will have a value of dollars per ton of CO2 with the ETS. And then that's something that can be regulated. As far as now, we're planning this from a simulation perspective. And this is the good thing, is that this value, it's something that can be configured. We can do calculations, assuming that this value is very high, assuming that this value is very low, or assuming that this value is non-existent. If you put a price to 0, then you would have the cost optimal trajectory regardless of climate. If we put a value very high, then you would automatically go to climate optimal trajectories, right? And this is something that we can, I mean, I know in other episodes, you also talked about the carrot and the stick and how this will eventually be implemented. Will it be a taxation? Will it be an incentive? This is, kind of a complicated topic. What we see from our side is, airlines could have the choice of setting this value to whatever they want until if eventually this becomes a tax, and then that the price per ton of CO2 equivalent will be this much, then the optimizer will account for that much, and that's it. If not, airlines can play around with this value, so they can set it low, they can set it high, they can set it whatever, and see what different options the optimizer would give, and then the dispatcher can choose. Okay, so if we set it low, then I would say maybe we're going to reroute the most warming areas, but not all areas, because that would be just completely inefficient. If we set it medium, then we will avoid a bit more of areas, but not all of them. And then if you set it super high, then every single Contrail probability area will be avoided, So the idea is a bit to give the power back to airlines and to set this in terms of cost, which is something way more visible, way more visceral for airlines, because that's what they usually talk in. And that's how I think it's going to be working operationally, at least in the near future. That's how we envision Flightkeys is going to provide this. We already have the Polygon-based approach. We already have it for our customers to use, but we recognize that, it slows down the optimization process because you have way more restrictions in the airspace. And what we notice is that there are situations where our optimizer cannot find the solution to the optimization problem. So you cannot reroute around Contrail's area, I'm sorry. But with the cost avoidance, it will not be a yes or no, and this is the price and this is the fuel. It will be, we can give you different options based on your environmental strategy and how much you want to invest in this. And then we can, you can choose from these options which one you think is the best. So it's a more flexible solution, soft constraints, and we think this is how it's going to go operationally, most likely in the future, in the next months.
We've learned so much about flight planning today, and it was very insightful. And what gives hope is certainly that we are now moving from doing simulations and analyses to actual real life trials. And you've already gave us a little bit of a teaser by mentioning a paper that comes out regarding maybe big hits. I don't know. We're really excited to see that. Another teaser that we need to plug here now is our next guest. And the next guest will be Rémi Chevalier. And in our tradition, you have the chance to pass on a question to him.
Oh, Rémi is a tough one. But I guess, Rémi, in your honest opinion, do you think we will have Contrail avoidance implemented commercially in the next 5 years?
That's a good one. I think I'm going to stress the honest opinion part of the question. But other than that, this was great. We could continue for hours. And it's just great to see the progress that you're doing with Flightkeys and within your PhD. So all the best on that journey. And hopefully speak soon.
Thank you very much, Marius, Kieran. It's been a pleasure. I love your podcast and I will recommend it to everybody, especially my parents, since they don't believe me.
Thanks for the support.
Thanks for the support and thanks for being here.
Bye-bye.
All the best.
Bye.
Bye.